Welcome to the RightsCon panel for COVID-19 apps, the good, the bad, and the ugly. My name is Dave Gershgorn, and I'm very happy to be moderating this panel with some fantastic panelists. So we'll get into introducing them right now. We have Ali Funk, who is the Senior Research Analyst for Technology and Democracy at Freedom House. We have Kirsten Hahn, a freelance journalist and curator of We the Citizens. We have Sarkis Darbanyan, founder of RosKomSvoboda. And we have Rohan Garg, Associate Policy Counsel at Internet Freedom Foundation. So we thank all of them for being here today, and we will get right into it. We're hoping to have a conversation. So if the panelists have a point to add or want to continue a line of thinking, please jump in as well as we can in a virtual environment. And if you have questions for other panelists, feel free to jump in because that also just makes my life easier. And to start off, we have an audience poll. So if you scroll down, you can see the poll questions. And right now we're asking, do people in your city, state, or country use COVID-19 apps? So if you want to answer that poll question and then hop in the chat and talk about it, we're monitoring the chat for questions as the panel goes on. So we will get right to our fantastic panelists. And our first question is a little bit of scene setting. And I think it's best if we all get on the same page in terms of what kinds of COVID-19 apps have been launched. So I was hoping we can get Rohan to speak to this. So what are the range of functions that COVID-19 apps have, and what kind of information do they collect, pretty basically, to perform those functions?
Thanks, Dave. So I'll speak mostly to the Indian context, but I think that applies broadly. So we broadly from the government, we have two COVID apps. One is, of course, the Indian government's contact tracing app called Arogya Setu. And that was built out under much furor, and it collects a variety of data. So firstly, it collects a lot of health data. So this includes some basic sort of EHRs, electronic health records that you put online. It also includes personal information, not just about your age and where you live, but also something called the Aadhaar, sort of a state ID. It also then goes beyond that, and it asks you to always keep your Bluetooth and your location on. So those two very important pieces of data are always being collected. The Arogya Setu initially was a contact tracing app, but involved into this without really any statutory backing. It evolved into this larger sort of catch-all app. So you had contact tracing, but you also had registration for vaccines. You had, if there were any sort of e-passes that you needed to go between areas in which there was a lockdown, that system was integrated. You could also just see who are infected in your neighborhood. So that's one sort of set of functions. India also specifically had almost begrudgingly really, had this vaccine enrollment app called CoWIN, and that too collected a lot of this sort of personal information with the specific purpose, of course, here being just vaccine enrollment. Interestingly, though, I think this is one aspect that has come up in more recent times. We've seen a spate of, if not private, some of it through apps, some of it through platforms, but a set of scripts that you can basically run to access appointments on India's vaccination app because there aren't enough spaces. They come online at a specific time. So what people do is they effectively game the system. So if you know how to code, you can just write out a little script that as soon as an appointment pops up, you can go and sort of pick that time. But this is obviously skews towards a certain demographic that is upper class, has a lot of access to resources, but also is very digitally literate. And I think that's sort of the broad play field we're operating in.
And Kirsten, is this similar? I know that you have written a lot about Singapore. Are these similar permissions and data that are being collected in the apps that are used there?
Quite similar. Have to and even you can use Bluetooth and close based check-in and many mall shops. And used to be separate merchants. So and malls you have to scan or to enter into public venues.
I'm sorry, Kirsten. We're having a bit of trouble hearing you in terms of the connection. So I was wondering if maybe we could take a quick pause. I'm very interested in what you have to say on this. But for the sake of the internet connection and hearability, maybe Sarkis, would you be able to kind of answer in Russia? Are there similar permissions? What kind of data is being collected through these apps?
Yes, hello, Dave, once again. Russia showed that it is very technology prepared for COVID. And since the start of the pandemic, the Russian authorities have launched 4 different apps with basically used to issue digital passes, to monitor people under quarantine, and track contacts with those infected with coronavirus. But for sure, the most controversial thing was with the app in Russia's lockdown was called the social monitoring app. There were masses of complaints by Moscovites about mistakes in the way the app worked. People received automatic fines for violating quarantine, sometimes when they had never left their residence or when the quarantine was actually over. How did it work? It was released in a such way that doctors who went from door to door on the calls of bad mood were required to obtain this consent to voluntarily use of this application. Otherwise, the doctors predicted that in case of refusal to sign a consent with the using of application, there will be a decision on the compulsory detention to the observatory, where the conditions of detention of people were far from perfect, you know. And that is, in fact, the application became mandatory because it actually deprived the person of choice. Doctors, instead of medical treatment, were engaged in the some administrative functions of getting written consents from people for using apps and giving the Moscow authorities around-the-clock surveillance on the patients for 2 weeks. The app required sending geotagged selfies several times a day. And if a person for some reason missed sending a selfie, an automatic fine was issued. It became possible because during the pandemic period in Moscow, the code of administrative offenses was changed. And from the last year, it became possible to fine citizens for violation of self-isolation and mandatory quarantine on the basis of algorithmic decision. Of course, there were a lot of mistakes and illegal fines. There were a lot of cases of wrong diagnosis as well. And Moscovites began to complain that due to the incorrect operation of the app, they received fines about 70 American dollars, although they didn't even leave the apartment. And for violation of self-isolation, only in Moscow, we issued more than 100,000 of fines. Even people with no mobility were fined, which looked, you know, especially cynical. Later, many fines were canceled by the courts, including my personal fines in connection with the refusal of the Moscow authorities from further prosecution of myself, but without explaining any reason of that. And only after I went to court, they were canceled. We have helped a lot of people, but those who didn't go to court were forced to pay. And it was like, you know, a really testing ground for people for using these new measures of surveillance and control. So after that, Moscow mayor announced that the city authorities were not planning to store the data collected on the system, but still they didn't delete it, and they don't give any information that it's gonna be deleted. They say when all of the course will be finished, what is absolutely strange term, then they will delete all this data. So now everything in Moscow looks like the pandemic is over. All restrictive measures have been lifted. Digital passes are canceled. However, of course, we have to do work on these mistakes right now, because we don't know if another wave of a virus will hit us in near future. And we still have a lot of legal questions about practices and laws that were introduced during this period.
Mm-hmm. And Kirsten, I'm interested to get back to what you were saying. Now, are these kinds of permissions, like Bluetooth and the data that's actually being collected, are those similar across Singapore in the apps that you've studied?
Yep. So we have Trace Together, which is a Bluetooth system that works either as an app or a token. And then we have Safe Entry, which is a check-in system where you used to scan a QR code to get into malls and restaurants. But now they've merged the two systems and made both mandatory. So now when you go into a mall or a restaurant, you have to scan your Trace Together app or your token.
Got it. And Ali, I was hoping that you could kind of give us a high level view of the human rights implications and the potential, future uses of this kind of data. How does this change the ability of governments to, like Sarkis was saying, impose fines or monitor people's movements and things like that?
Yeah, happy to do so, and happy to be here. I mean, as all my panelists, the different examples that folks brought up, and I think it's exemplary of the name of this panel, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Not all the apps are created the same, and some are more intrusive than others. I think on the least intrusive side, they're still, problematic in a number of ways. There's been a lot of governments or companies that have tried to roll out apps that use sort of privacy but by design principles. So things like data minimization, storing data on users' phones versus like a government server, and using Bluetooth over, say, like GPS tracking for location tracking. But still, I mean, there are human rights risks to even the most well-designed tools, I think. Generally apps are just really opaque about how they collect, store, and process data, and who can access that and how it's shared. And then even if the tool itself, let's say, is open source or decentralized, and can be audited, by independently, all the other apps on our phones, right, can pull data, and then that information could be sold to advertisers or data brokers in the US is one of the big issues we're dealing with, or insurers. And then, the human rights risks of more invasive tools, particularly when it's a government-owned app, is, some of the examples we've been talking about now, is that they're collecting, demographic information, location data, to facilitate sort of user identification. And a lot of this information, is really personal of where you've been, where your name, of maybe who you're communicating with, and based on your location, a government can know a lot about you, right? Like if you show up at a certain time each week at a particular location, and there's a mosque around or a church around, that can speak to your religious identity. Or if you are, showing up at a different time at a different time of the day, it could speak to your different like sexual orientation. So these really intimate details about us that these apps are collating. And then, in a lot of these countries, there might not be a strong data privacy or data protection law that is really limiting how this information can be used, and by whom. And then some of these apps are being connected to even more intrusive tools like facial recognition they might be using, or electronic wristbands in a lot of countries. And then, time after time, we see that location data can be used, or phone records, to identify and arrest folks, journalists, activists, and also just ordinary users that the state deems dangerous to their sort of political or social goals. We see personal data like this and other forms of metadata like location show up as evidence in sort of politicized criminal cases against activists and human rights defenders. And then location data, can be used to track protesters or prove that you were at a protest that the government might deem illegal. And then there's sort of the whole private company element of it, of how companies like insurance companies, advertising agencies might be able to exploit or use this information for their own commercial ends. And then the last thing I'll mention is there's also this broader societal risk that we've been thinking a lot about, is how these apps can further entrench sort of societal inequalities. So not everyone has access to a smartphone. Not everyone has equal access to sort of vaccines when you're talking about vaccine passports. So what you're doing is you're creating a situation in which there's sort of this like digital social sorting about people who have access to phones or people who have access to vaccines have better access to public services like transportation or malls or going back to work. So it's really creating more of an inequitable society that is, I think, quite concerning.
So I'm really interested in hearing about how that digital divide has played out in places like Singapore or India. And Rohan or Kirsten, do you want to, or Sarkis, if you have to something to add, do any of you want to kind of jump in and talk to that point and see how about how things have been on the ground?
So I can go first there. So as might be expected, there has actually been a huge impact. I think, so it's a couple of ways. So firstly, our second wave is now receding, but it got pretty bad, as might be expected. And for example, in the city I live in, they said that you have to have certain apps installed, or you have to have, say, that Aadhaar card, a certain identity card, if you want to get a bed. And obviously not everyone can afford that app. And so there were, though I think that law was sort of finagled over, and they got, some people were just sort of arbitrarily given beds. There were some cases where people were actually denied COVID-19 beds just because they didn't have this app. Another way we are seeing it is in the vaccine rollout. So we do have a deficit of vaccines, but this is made even sort of worse by the fact that you have to register online on this portal through the app to get the vaccine. So there's no walk-ins. Even though we've had multiple successful vaccination programs in the past where we had walk-ins, crowds, it's not as if crowds at vaccination centers are sort of being affected, because there's still a crowd. And so people who aren't able to register on the app, which would be a lot of people in India, because even though our digital sort of base is growing, digital literacy, and so really how to navigate the internet and how to navigate apps on your own has not grown at the same pace, not nearly the same pace. And so they are excluded. We've seen places of, in rural areas, there are more spaces because people don't necessarily know how to operate the app. They haven't registered. So you'll find people from, say, urban metropolises like Delhi going 200 kilometers away to some rural village to get a vaccination. And while there's the villagers there who are now at much more of a risk, because in this way we've actually seen rural India hit by COVID, they aren't getting the vaccine. So there's a lot of ways in which these inequities are springing up. Another way, I think, is, for example, with the e-passes and with the contact tracing app. So the app would show the status. So the algorithm would take in all your contact, all your location data, your Bluetooth data, all your health sort of data, and assign you status of at risk, not at risk, marginally at risk, whatever, some percentage. Now, a lot of people, for example, who relied on public transport to go to the places of work once they started opening up, they were unable to board, for example, the subway or the metro or the bus to actually take to go to the work. So because obviously they didn't have that app. They couldn't afford the data. They couldn't afford keeping their location sharing on all the time. So at least in India, we have seen a tremendous impact on the digital divide, so to speak. And I'm afraid it's continued so far. I don't think there's any abatement.
And Kirsten, have you seen the same thing?
Yeah. So in Singapore, the community that was hardest hit by COVID was our migrant worker community in the dormitories. So the dormitories were then fully locked down. And so all these men were being confined in their hot, stuffy rooms of like 8 to 20 people in a room. They're still being confined, actually. A lot of them are still only allowed to go to work and then back to their dorm and not come out unless they have some sort of special pass that will give them 3 hours break a week. I think a month, sorry. And so these COVID apps that were originally voluntary for most of Singapore were made mandatory for them a lot earlier. And they have multiple apps that they're tracking. So, you know, they have to have Trace Together. They have to download another app that like reports their health to the Ministry of Manpower. And so that we had a situation where there were volunteer groups that were trying to get people to donate their old smartphones, because a lot of these migrant workers didn't have smartphones that were modern enough to accept the specs that was needed for these apps to work. And if they didn't have the app, they were not allowed back onto the site, and then they wouldn't be able to earn money and everything. So we had to, so there were a lot of those issues, and they're still more surveilled and more tracked than the rest of the population, with more movement restrictions as well.
And Sarkis, you mentioned that these apps were similarly mandatory. How has the Russian government dealt with people who just don't have phones?
I don't know how it was happening in other parts of Russia, but here in Moscow, if you don't have a cell phone, the social service will bring you a cell phone. It will be some cheap cell phone, some Android cell phone for $100. But yeah, I got the information that they bought lots of them, and they were supplying patients with this cell phones. And as I mentioned, even it was called to be voluntarily, but still people didn't have any choice to take the cell phone with pre-installed social monitor app and to be on this 24/7 online surveillance.
Yeah, and I imagine that there could be anything loaded on that phone, really, right? Like you don't really have any control or idea.
Sure, yeah, no one had any control. No one could understand how it works. Some people told that these phones got very bad battery, and the charger was not supplied, and he had no any opportunity to go to the store to buy a charger. So it just switched off, and when it was switching off, it was making an automatic fine.
Wow. Yeah, that seems like a, kind of screwed if you do, screwed if you don't type situation. We have a chat storm that we're hoping to do. Who knows how stormy it will be, but let's hope the storm rages. I don't know. But if you could share your experience with COVID-19 apps in the chat, some people have done that, already, and we would love to get some more audience interaction. And also, don't forget to answer the polls. It seems you can do them all at the same time, which is fantastic. And the results update live, so you can see how other viewers of this fantastic panel have interacted with the COVID-19 apps as well. Now, I had another question for Rohan, especially with the Aadhaar digital identity platform. And it seems that there are a ton of countries around the world who are also taking on these digital identity schemes. And I was wondering how this specific COVID-19 app infrastructure and the potential surveillance that comes with it has been enabled or made easier by having an existing digital identity platform.
So I think Aadhaar has been in place in India for some time, and I think in a variety of contexts, from our ration system, which distributes food grains to people at low prices or free, to school attendance systems. Many sort of defects have been found because what these machines do is they store a lot of data, including, for example, biometric data, fingerprint data, and iris data as well. And so, for example, if I go to a ration shop, I'm supposed to there's this point of sale machine. I give it my thumbprint. It authenticates the transaction. Then I get my free whatever 5 kilos of rice, whatever. The issue, I think, the major issue that has been studied across various contexts is that it's very sort of funky. So it has a lot of errors, inconsistencies, and all this has meant a lot of exclusion. The government has taken some steps to make it more efficient, and while that has meant a lower rate of error or leakage, that has increased exclusion rates. And what this means, for example, there's some states where I think after 40, 50 years, we're hearing of food deaths in India, right? Where this family was denied food, their rations, because someone in their family, not even the entire family, didn't have an Aadhaar card. So that's sort of the exclusion part. What it also does is that because it has so much data, it's used everywhere. If you go to your bank and you have to sort of authenticate your personhood through a know your customer form, Aadhaar is used. If you want to use a payment app, Aadhaar is used. If you want to get a vaccine right now, Aadhaar is used. So this basically just means to more and more data being centralized and stored, which the government has access to, but not just the government. So the Aadhaar database, like I mentioned, is extremely leaky. And various sort of ethical hackers have shown that, you can just extract any sort of information. So for example, one of the members of the government think tank posted their Aadhaar ID on Twitter, and they said, okay, let's see who can do something. And so multiple people started popping in like 1 rupee, 2 rupee donations into his daughter's, not even his daughter's bank account. And so you can see how there's a lot of, thankfully nothing untoward happened, but you can see how there's a lot of things you can do with this, with this sort of data apparatus that exists. And unfortunately, given that there's no specific data retention timeline, we don't know if I say delete, if I say log out of the app, I say I want out, is my data actually being deleted? We've also seen with the vaccine rollout that India is rolling out a health ID. It's supposed to be voluntary, but basically anyone who gets a vaccine gets a health ID. That also has a lot of fears of not just surveillance, but exclusion, consent, and all that. So this is being used in a surreptitious manner to collect vast amounts of data about citizens, not just without their consent. That would seem unnecessary for a public health perspective. And so what happens is that eventually we can only imagine right now, but presumably one big use of this indeed would be large-scale public surveillance.
Got it. And I think that an aspect of this is that people don't necessarily understand what data is being collected. And Ali, I was hoping that you could kind of speak to this, because we had someone in the chat, Janice, who was saying that, even if it tells you what information is being shared or collected, often the wording around that is really not understandable to the average person. So would you be able to speak to this idea and how some of the either wording around these apps or the way that they're being collected isn't entirely maybe understandable to the average person?
Yeah, I think if anybody's ever tried to read a privacy policy or terms of service for any sort of technology, it's my eyes immediately glaze over, and I'm sort of in this space. So, I can imagine for folks who are not super engaged, maybe sort of in the internet freedom community or privacy community, it's really confusing. And then for us who are in it, we're still really confused. So it seems like a lose-lose when we're trying to figure out what data is being collected, and then how it's going to be used. And there's one element of the app itself, right? Of how that app itself is collecting, but it's also what are all your other apps pulling from that on your phone. And I think this is where, when we talk about sort of what are the best principles for these tools, and first the question is like, do we even need them? because we don't have the data right now that says they're super effective in limiting the spread of disease. And, you know, are there less intrusive ways to reach our same goals? My argument would say, yes, there is. So that's step one of like, do we have evidence that they work? And then in doing so, are they proportional to the goals? And I think part of making sure that they're proportional is this transparency element and this oversight element of making sure that when you communicate to somebody who is using it, using very clear, understandable language about what information is collected, how that information is stored, whether it's on a phone, that would be the ideal situation, or if it's going to sort of a company server or a government server, and then who has access to that, what's going to happen after you delete your app, does that data get deleted with it, does it stay stored, and for like sort of how long. So, you know, I think there's really, a lot of these questions are really murky, and it's often because we're using, even for the best made apps, really legalese language that can just be hard to parse through.
Yeah, and you bring up a really, I'm sorry, go ahead, Kirsten.
I just wanted to jump in because Singapore had an experience where it was stated very clearly who had access to the app, and that was wrong. So when Trace Together was launched, it was on the government website. So it's a government developed app, and it was on the government website that this will only be used for contact tracing. And then the minister that was in charge of the department that launched it also came out in a press conference and said digital contact tracing data is only used for contact tracing, period. He was very clear about that. And then 6 months later, they come back and say, actually, guess what? Under the law, the police have access to this data all the time. They've already accessed it for murder investigation. And that same minister stood up and went, I'm really sorry, guys, but I forgot about this law at the time. And so we had a case where it was very clearly stated on the website who had access, and that was still wrong. Whether it was dishonest or if it was an honest oversight, like, you know, we don't really know at this point, but that was that created a bit of an outcry because people felt like there was this bait and switch that had been done on them, in forcing us to get on this. And then the app was still made mandatory anyway. So like after this big like loss of faith, we still had to all use it. And what they did to kind of backpedal that was pass a new law that restricted the use of the data to 7 categories of serious offenses like murder, rape, or kidnapping, that the police could get the data for, which was then framed as, oh, look, this is accountability, we're restricting access. But actually, it's still an expansion of what we were told.
Yeah, I think that Kirsten cut out there for a second for me, but I think
would be the case before, which except for contact tracing as well.
Got it. This brings up a really interesting kind of point, which is what has been done versus what has been said. And a lot of this has to do, I think, with accuracy as well, and the effectiveness of these passports and apps and such like that. And Ali spoke to this a little bit before, but I was wondering if anybody could jump in and talk about, have these apps been effective, or have they done the job that they've actually said that they were going to do?
So if I can jump in here. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes.
Sorry.
So I was just going to say that I don't think we know for sure. So in Singapore, they say that it works well and that it's half the time of the time it takes to contact trace. But we don't know what that's in relation to. Like, okay, if it's half the time, that's fine. But like, as Ali said, it has to be proportional, right? So half the time in comparison to what? And was it really necessary? Are these trade-offs necessary for you to do that? So Singapore was already being referred to as a gold standard in contact tracing before we introduced all these apps. So in early 2020, we were supposed to be like the role model country in contact tracing. And that was before all these apps came in. So it's not clear to us that actually these apps are worth the trade-off.
So we've had a slightly different sort of experience, but broadly I would agree in that. So a lot of scientists, especially and especially computer scientists, have raised issues of, okay, there have been multiple reports about false negatives, false positives, and the fact that you are using what the algorithm throws up, which is a prediction of risk, as gospel. Whereas even if you were to follow through with this method, you must have risk intervals. There must be a probability assigned to that risk, right? I mean, in fact, the risk itself is a probability. So that at a scientific and technical level, that issue has not been addressed. The government think tank came out and said that, okay, this is as of, I believe, September 2020 approximately, that the national positivity average is around 8% for testing, whereas the app's positivity was 27%. And that was touted as a positive. But of course, something that overestimates something by more than 3.5 times, around 3.5 times, is not really a positive. It's a catch-all. There's no confidence whether that 8% and that 27% even completely sort of intersect. So they've not really, I could say, I mean, on the issue of efficacy, I'm not sure that they have been. For example, the Indian state of Kerala, which did receive some plaudits for initially for handling of the pandemic, they had relied on a much more direct model of contact tracing. So where you'd put together a lot of groups of people who would use local government records and go door to door and say, okay, who all of you interacted with, as opposed to a method that relies on this sort of constant harvesting, really, of data. So even though I think even people who were a bit critical of this would have wanted, I mean, digital technology has got us tremendous benefits, right? And if it could have helped us contain this pandemic of course, in a manner that doesn't erode any sort of rights that a citizen should get, that would have been a good thing. But I think that has really almost very emphatically not happened. And I would, in fact, very strongly say that, yeah, I don't think they've been that effective.
Got it. I want to direct our audience members to the chat right now. In a few minutes, we're going to be doing some Q&A. So if you have any questions, speaking to the various expertises of our panelists, that would be fantastic. Any questions that you have are accepted. And I do have a question now that's based off of a experience from Angela in the chat, talking about Malaysia's app, which is asking permission for media files like photos, audio, video, which is allegedly to get profile pictures, but also the camera for scanning the QR code. And it seems that this is kind of a permissions on a phone are a blunt tool, right? It's not often very nuanced in terms of what photos that you can that the app is allowed to access, when the camera is allowed to be accessed, all of these things. So I was wondering if any of the panelists had some more information about potential overreach, potential limitations, how the broad adoption of these kind of give access to everything on your phone has impacted people's privacy, and whether there are any examples of this going awry. If not, that's totally fine too. We got more questions.
So I'll try and offer at least some comment here. I think this has to be seen in a larger context of, okay, how is the consent mechanism operated here? At the very fundamental level, we've seen where in India, in some places, they were not only made mandatory, they were made mandatory to the point of criminal liability. So you would be criminally liable if you didn't have this app. And of course, there were fight back, there was resistance, and that went away. But I think that is at the broad level that indicated that consent was not something that was going to be suitably accounted for. Then you go from the macro level, you go to the micro level, which is of course the app permissions. And I think some phones have the feature, right, where you can say, for example, you get to use a certain function while the app is open. But I'm not sure, for example, India, a lot of people have those sort of phones, because that's a very new feature that's coming in. And so at least for some such people, precisely what Angela has pointed out, right, where why would you need to access the media files, even if you would notionally want to access the camera for like 5 seconds max at certain points. And that just speaks to the fact that clearly these are not only meant for contact tracing. They're obviously meant for the larger design of collecting data, and in at least in India's case, very emphatically surveillance. And this is off tangent, as this is sort of a tangent, but so for example, in India, certain political prisoners were released, and one of their bail conditions was, okay, you have to download the app. Now, that has no real, I mean, whether they download the app has no real connection to the criminal case. That's part of the court. Whether he downloads is a public health matter, regardless of whether he should or not. But to make one's bail condition downloading the app means that, okay, we believe that this is an adequate tool to keep track of your location. Ergo, there's obviously a larger design at play. And I think within that paradigm, then it's not really surprising that, okay, they want all this data.
Totally.
Yeah, I think in Singapore. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to add from my experience when we got some deep dive to the terms of service of a Russian application, what is called social monitoring. We found it that all of the people who use this application also gave consent for getting some commercial ads from the Moscow authorities and its organizations. And that was completely ridiculous, you know, to put this in the privacy policy from where a person cannot refuse to give the consent on that, because this is only one consent for using one application. And we made a couple of requests to the Moscow authorities, because that was a very concerning thing. Last year, he was adopted a law about the artificial intelligence, and Moscow became a regime, some kind of experimental regime zone where the commercial entities who are in this registry can get data from the Moscow authorities. And it means that taking this data from people to use app to monitor the quarantine and self-isolation, they got indefinitely time a consent to use this data and to share with lots of different organizations who people even don't know when giving consent. And that's what's happening when the state is trying to give this application without any kind of mandatory audit of the code of the policies and the things that this application can do.
Yeah, it's one of these things where, especially when you start adding marketing data into the mix, I mean, then you have data aggregators. You've got all of these different integrators and third-party tools that might be, you know, helping the government disseminate this or put it some you know, third-party backbone in terms of how the ads are sent, or any of those pieces that are also collecting the data and sharing it, and it just becomes this this absolute mix. But Kirsten, I'm very interested in what you were about to say as well.
Yeah, so I think to share that it's not just the app itself that's on your phone, but also this whole ecosystem that's sprung up around it, right? So I think if I can just share my screen, this is a photo that I took today in Singapore, in the middle of our city. And this is what it looks like now if you want to enter a mall. So these are actual gantries where you have to scan either your app or your token. So we all you can pick one up and they'll give it to you. You have to scan that. And then that little screen that you see there takes your temperature And then if your temperature's okay and you've scanned the app, then the door opens and then you can go in. It causes a jam sometimes when like it stops working and everyone gets backed up behind it. But those little screens that take your temperature also have cameras on them. And it's not clear to us going through if the camera's capturing, you know, if it's recording or if it's taking a photo. Some of these ones that I've seen can actually tell if you're wearing a mask or not. So it's definitely like the camera is definitely on, but is it collecting the data? We don't really know. So this is what it looks like when you go out. But so I looked up
Looks awful,
one of the
Kristen.
Huh? Yeah. I looked
Looks
at one of the
awful,
companies. Yeah. I looked at one of the companies that does these facial recognition thermometer things. And in its presentation, it was saying that apart from this COVID stuff, what it could be used for in the future is in place of a time card for your employees. So it will know exactly what time your employee came to work. We can generate you a report that tells you, even if your employee is late to work by 2 minutes, we can track which days they didn't come into work, which days they took sick leave, what their temperature was when they came in. And so clearly this technology, you know, once you put it together, you don't unmake it. It can be adapted for other use. And then when they put out these gantries, it makes it look like there is no end date to this. Because why would all these small operators and why would the government have invested so much money in developing these things, building these things, to say like, oh, it's just an emergency measure? You know, once you've developed it, the instincts that governments and employers and companies have is to start looking for other users for it.
Yeah, this is something that actually, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to add, I mean, Kirsten brings up this really great point of, you know, our panel today is focused on sort of COVID-19 apps, but these are existing, you know, first within a broader ecosystem of COVID-19 surveillance, in which you have broader agreements to share location data or other demographic information from service providers, you know, mobile service providers, other telecom, to governments. Or you have in countries like Pakistan, you have the military involved in sort of track and trace efforts. And then in a lot of countries, you have an increase of biometric surveillance. So, you know, new companies now are saying they can use facial recognition to monitor you under a mask, or like claims around these thermal scanners that can just, you know, scan a crowd and say who has a temperature. So, you know, the apps exist in that. And then more broadly, sort of just this like tracking ecosystem we're all living in. And, you know, Angela raised a good point of like, can we opt out of it? Is that even a thing? How do we know if we're being tracked? And it brings this sort of broader question of why sort of, you know, we as users and consumers can make individual choices that are slightly better for privacy or slightly better for our rights, but we need sort of broader protections and regulation that really rolls back the state and also the private company's ability to do it. Because, you know, as Kirsten just said, like, why is the government investing in a lot of these tools that clearly are not going to go away if they put this much money in?
Yeah, I think that this brings up, to Angela's point, I mean, I wonder if we can get a clear answer on how we know if we're being tracked by these apps. This is something where if you downloaded it, you should assume that you're being monitored. She asked whether they asked whether you should be covering your camera all the time. What are sort of some of the best practices to follow if you've downloaded these apps?
Well, this is not this. You didn't hear it from me, but one way is of course to delete as, I mean, so I personally, for example, had to, or someone I knew had to go to the bank and they had to deposit a check, and that someone just downloaded the app just at the doorstep of the bank. And they dropped the check in, came out, deleted it. I mean, so for example, the Indian app, it doesn't really work. So you can say notionally that, okay, I won't give you permission, but the app won't open. So even if, for example, you could presume that you could, well, I'd presume that, okay, I could just turn it on once and that status would just stay, and I could turn off my permissions very naively. You can't, the app won't work. So there is really, it's tough to find workarounds. I mean, to me, I think one way would just be to not use them. and I mean, regardless of what responsibilities one has as in the midst of a public health disaster, I think if one has those grave concerns, that does seem to be one of the few options one has. But it's very tough to get out of that paradigm if you have the app. For just if I can add something, for example, what the Indian government has done, even people who have smartphones, they belatedly set up this voice recognition, this automated sort of system for handset phones, which are not like the older sort of phones. And I believe through their sort of Bluetooth functions, they're able to track them as well. So it's not like you can go offline for a bit to sort of get out of this. If you have the app, or if you're on the system, it's tough to sort of use it in a way that minimizes data loss. It's just going to be there.
Got it. I think something else, another element of this that I think I really want to make sure that we get to is how these apps come to an end, right? I think that a lot of these apps have been implemented without a clear exit strategy. But I'm very interested in hearing from especially from you, Kirsten, where there's been infrastructure, right? With these staying pieces of technology that have been installed and people probably have a vested interest in keeping around. How, if any, has there been communication on when these apps are going to go away and when the data will be deleted and all of these different things? So Kirsten, maybe if you can start us off, and we'll go around to the other panelists after that.
So the government said that this digital contact tracing is only for COVID, and then as and when the COVID kind of pandemic is over, then they will stop doing this contact tracing. But when is the pandemic over? Like, at what stage do you count it as it's over? Because especially if they're talking about how COVID is probably going to eventually become endemic. So at what stage of that does it become, okay, this is no longer an emergency, we're going to stop the contact tracing? It's not clear. We've not been given any sort of, like, not even a tentative end date, right? I think it would be better practice if government set a tentative end date. And then if it's, as we approach that end date, it looks like the pandemic is still coming in multiple waves, then apply to have that end date extended according to due process. That makes more sense to me. But right now we have this very open-ended of, it's over when we say it's over. The government's the one who says it's the end date, but the government also is the one that decides when the pandemic is over in Singapore. So they do say that when the program is over, they'll delete the data. But again, without external oversight and without independent monitoring, it's really hard. You just have to take their word for it that they've deleted it. But what if they haven't? It's hard to find out. Even if they haven't, they have laws that deal with misuse of data, but those laws don't address users' rights. So we have laws that say, if a public servant misuses data, they can get punished. And yeah, there are penalties for that person, but it doesn't address the rights of the users whose privacy have been breached. So we have these problems. It would be so much better if governments could communicate to people that, this is the trade-off that we are making, why we are making it, what exactly this does, and that it's targeted and necessary and also temporary. And I think, they've been talking about that in Taiwan for a long time, that the sort of tracing that they do is very targeted and very deep, but they're very clear about how it's temporary, and that reassures people and gets trust as well.
And Sarkis, you had hammered home that this is definitely mandatory, and they'll bring you a phone, right, if you don't have one. So how has there been any talk about taking this mandatory these mandatory apps into a only if you've been exposed, or some other level of it being non-mandatory, or is it basically mandatory until we say otherwise?
Well, I would say that till now there are no any new usage of the application, because as I said before, it looks like the pandemic is over, but we shouldn't forget about these applications that went to some kind of sleeping mode. And if a new pandemic hits us or something new happens, because there were even some ideas, actually there were some ideas last year to use this application for the migration control, because it's almost the same technology. For sure, we can face them again. And I'm afraid that states are already armed with the technology, and they will use it anytime when they want to. And we hear nothing about deleting data, but even if they say that the data is completely deleted, we don't have any, a reason to believe them, that there are no backups and the data will not be reused later. Because we still don't have the independent effective body for controlling privacy here in Russia that can have control authorities to go to other state bodies, to the regional authorities, and look what they're really looking with this data. So I'm in a very bad feeling about all this, and I think that we're gonna deal with these applications in future more and more.
Yeah. And Ali, I was hoping that you could also speak to, other places in the world where maybe there have been good examples of governments who have said, in addition to Taiwan, that like we're going to end this data collection, the usage of the app, or examples where, if it's widespread, that there's been no end date in sight.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think Taiwan's a really interesting example because they used a lot of, I guess, sort of innovative digital tracking tools. I don't think, in my opinion, some of them would not be proportionate to what the stated aim is. I think there was pretty broad sharing of location data, but there are, certain protections. There's a data protection law in place. There is sort of better trust in government compared to certain other countries, and more transparency around these tools, and sort of the technical community in the country, I think, is pretty aware of it. So it's an interesting case where some of the tools might be a little bit more invasive in my opinion, but there's this broader environment of sort of better transparency than say in the US, for example. Like another, I think, sort of example that adopted some more of the privacy by design was the DP3T protocol, created by sort of these group of Swiss experts. But I think I know we only have 2 minutes left. One point that I wanted to make about how do we push back against this, or how do we try to get governments to delete the data or protect privacy better? I think this is where the role of civil society comes in, and journalists and researchers who are working to uncover the ways in which governments and private companies are abusing the data collected by these apps, to try to put public pressure to either roll them back or to limit them, or to make very clear independent oversight or sort of some sort of regulation about how it can be used. And I know, like in the case of internet shutdowns, we've seen around the world how strategic litigation has been really impactful in a lot of countries. So that could be a path in certain places where you have room for independent judiciary to push back against the government. Maybe that's a way that we can, sort of organize and work together to try to push back against these apps and limit their use in the future.
Yeah. Well, we are pushing up against time. I want to give a special mention to our panelists. There are a few questions in the chat. After we're done live streaming, if maybe you want to drop an answer or two in, because there was some questions about privacy concerns generally and things like that. So I recommend that we all go in there and answer any hanging questions. But I want to thank all of the panelists for their time and their energy and their expertise. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope everyone watching did as well. Thank you everyone who has tuned in, participated in chat, done the polls, and engaged with us. I'm sure all of the panelists are available on the internet over social media or something like that. So I encourage you to reach out and ask any other questions. Thank you so much.